Hey guys, I'm Mythanor, and I'm here today to take a look at a deck. This is the Skellige discard deck that has been floating around. It is unique in when it first came to be popular, in that it runs Ceres but no QueensGuards. We haven't seen much with that before. We've seen Ceres and QueensGuards paired all the time, but never as a top tier deck. This, without QueensGuards, being a pure discard deck, but with the inclusion of Ceres as a gold instead of a different inclusion for something else like Yalmar, we're seeing this appear as a very, very strong deck. Definitely tier 1 at this point. So I'm going to take a look at it and give a rundown of the deck for anyone who still doesn't know about it, as well as just kind of walk through some of the cards in it, as well as some synergies and why I think this deck is very powerful in the current meta. So we're going to start with the golds. For the golds, we have Ceres, Coral, Ermion, and Lugos. So I'm going to start with Ceres. Ceres is one of the main focuses of this deck. She has the potential to be 21 points of gold over the course of the 3 rounds, given her unique ability. Her ability is to resurrect herself from the graveyard after 4 other resurrects on your side of the battlefield. Meaning that you want to discard her really early and then have resurrections go off. Things coming out of your graveyard in order to tick down this timer to have Ceres res. And with the amount of resurrects that this deck has at its disposal, you can easily get her out in all 4 rounds. And along with her, she's a 6 base, but along with her ability, she's usually one of your first things to discard, and you always use King Bran to discard her. And she is your first pick with King Bran. King Bran, discard up to 3 cards from your deck and strengthen the units among them by 1. Then shuffle your deck back. Now, this has been a leader for a while. Like his ability has not changed much, a long time. But there is something different now that I didn't know about this before, and I don't know how many other people knew about this either, but the order in which you discard does matter. So when you discard Ceres, for example, you always want to discard her first, because with King Bran, usually your discards are going to be Ceres, a Raider, and Morkvarg. Now, why those 3? Well, Ceres you want in your graveyard as soon as possible, and you want that extra point on her, because that extra point with her coming back is basically 3 extra points, and it's on a gold body, so it's extremely valuable on her. But also with that, the order you select the cards in your deck is the order they get discarded. So you select Ceres first, she gets discarded into your graveyard, and then you go on to select your other units. And the reason you want Raiders and Morkvarg is for 2 reasons, actually several reasons. They are perfect discard cards in that they resurrect themselves. So they put 2 ticks instantly on Ceres. So Ceres, you discard her, you discard those 2. She's already down to 2 ticks left on her timer. It's very, very good. Plus, it's a tempo play. You get out a 5-point Morkvarg because he gets discarded, and he comes back, he reduces himself to 4 points, then he gets buffed by Bran or strengthened by Bran to 5 points. And the Raider in the first round will go in the graveyard, resurrect at 4 points. So you have a 4-point body, a 5-point body, and a 4-point body in one play, along with putting ticks on Ceres. Very good combo right there. And if you have ships set up, you get even more points out of the discards there. So that's why that's what Ceres is used for in this deck, and that's also why there's so many resurrects in this deck without resurrect targets. But we'll talk about that more later when I get to the priestesses and Sigdrifa. Next up, we have Ermion. Ermion is a very obvious inclusion in any discard deck because he is ability to pull through your deck, draw through your deck, as well as discard. So he gets 2 discards, meaning your captains get buffed by 2 each when you play Ermion. So he's a 7-point body, buffing for 6 points if you have 3 captains. So, you know, it's across your deck or your hand. Maybe one of them's on the battlefield, but still, it's buffs to units on your side. And he can combo very well with this deck because he can discard Raiders or he can discard Olgierd. There's so many things in this deck that are perfect to discard. Basically, there's only a few cards in this deck that you absolutely do not want to discard, and those would be your pirates because you should have played them already and they should have discarded themselves. Captains you don't usually want to discard. There is a few rare exceptions where you could discard them, but generally you don't want to. But besides that, it's your golds, and Saris is already knocked out. You've already played Ermion, so that only leaves 2 golds, and if you're drawing both of these golds, you should probably have something else in your hand that you're okay with discarding. You'll probably, if you're drawing into 2 golds after playing Ermion, you might have still a Priestess or a Raider, and it is okay to discard those. Raiders are perfect discard fodder because you don't want to play them from hand in the first place, and they resurrect, so they're extra tempo. Also ticks on Saris. Priestesses as well, okay to discard because you're not using them for power plays by themselves, you're using them for their resurrectability to get ticks on Saris later rounds. You do also use them as, you know, resing units, but they're not absolutely necessary for resing a specific unit like they are in a QueensGuard deck, for example. And then boats are also okay to discard because in later rounds you might not be needing them anymore, or if it's early you might, you know, discard one of them and then resurrect it, and so you get a lot of value out of it anyway. Also fine option there. And then Sigdrifa you don't really want to, or Udalric, but Grimmist and Donar are both okay discards as well because you can res them with Sigdrifa, and they are good units in that Donar discards from your opponent's deck, and you can use Grimmist as a tech against things like Cow Carcass or traps, but they are okay to play from your graveyard like that, given you're paying attention to your Saris and the timer she has. So that kind of covers Ermion. And then we have Lugos. Madman Lugos, 7-point body, very good gold already, considering his ability, which is to pick a bronze unit in your deck, discard it, and then damage any unit on the field, including on your side, by that unit's base health. So what this means is Lugos has fantastic synergy with this deck. Lugos can be used in conjunction with a Raider here. You play in round 3, for example, you play Lugos as a 7-point body, pick a Raider at 6 points because they have the veteran tag, which means they are strengthened by 1 every round, so in round 3 they are 6 points. You hit opponent for 6 points, that's 13 points already. The Raider comes back, that is 19 points right there. And if you're pulling Saris out, that's an additional 7. So you could be looking at 26 points right there, given that play. It also buffs all of your captains that you have remaining. So you could be looking at upwards of 29 points if you're pulling Saris and buffing all 3 captains in hand or something like that. Now that's a best case scenario, but that's still a very good best case scenario for a gold that also can remove an opponent's unit from the board. Very, very good amount of points there. You can also use him very early in the game to remove key opponent units, such as Mahakam Defenders. Now, you wouldn't be able to use a Clan Anka Raider, however, you could use a ship, for example. Use Lugos, throw a ship out, hit the Mahakam Defender, and it dies. Now, you're not getting as a high tempo play as you would if you played a Raider, but it is worth it in most situations to take out that dwarf before it can get buffed. Because if you can take it out before it's buffed, they're losing one of their resiliencies. And then you have Donar to hopefully remove another one. And maybe on top of that, you have Coral to just completely decimate their row with their dwarves on it. Which brings us to Coral. Coral, you play her as a 5-point gold body, pick a row, any row on the board, and you damage every unit every non-gold unit on that row by half their health rounded up. So what this means is you pick, let's say you hit a 5. That 5 is damaged for 3 points. And if there are a bunch of units on the row, you're damaging all of them by a lot of damage. So you have a 5 and a 6, you're damaging this for 3, and you're damaging this for 3. You have a 5 and a 7, you're damaging the 5 for 3 and the 7 for 4. Very good card. She's very powerful in this meta where there's a lot of row stacking. So she's a very good inclusion in this deck, despite her non-discard oriented nature. So then that brings us to our silvers. And so I'm going to start with Udalryk because Udalryk has a great synergy with one of the golds. That would be Coral. So Udalryk is a spy that draws the top 2 cards from your deck. You get to pick to keep one of them, the other one gets discarded. So what this means is you get a discard tick, which means if you have a boat on the field, so you can play Udalryk round 1. You play Udalryk, you have a boat on the field, you discard a unit. You are buffing all your captains, the ship fires for 2 damage, and you're playing a 12-point spy. It's not bad, it's pretty good, it's thinning, it's card advantage. Then on top of that, if you play Udalryk correctly and put him on a row that your opponent has a lot of powerful units, their most powerful row, then you play Coral, this spy suddenly becomes only a 6-point spy because you're hitting that row with Coral and you probably would have been hitting that row anyway. So you're hitting Udalryk as well for free, making him only a 6-point spy. Then you add in, the buffs you did and the ship damage. If you have all 3 ships, then he's essentially a free spy right there. Very good play, very good deck thinning, very good synergy with this deck if you can time it right and play him with Coral. So next we're going to talk about Olgierd and Morkvarg. Olgierd and Morkvarg are 2 very, very similar cards that behave slightly differently. They both are 9 base strength. They both will be resurrecting themselves depending on the situation. Morkvarg, when he dies, instantly will resurrect himself if he's not locked. Olgierd, when he dies, will resurrect himself at the start of the next round. So what this means is these guys, because of their recent changes, they got nerfed rather hard. They're not played as often anymore in any deck besides this, and maybe one Northern Realms deck, but we're not going to talk about that. They have their strength rounded up, so they go from 9 to 4 because 9 divided by 2 is 4.5, rounded up to 5, so they lose 5 base strength. Just a quick explanation of that. So they go from 9 to 4 unless you discard Udalryk with Bran, in which case he goes from 9 to 4, then +1 to 5. But these are not used as powerful carryover cards in this deck. These are used as a bit of carryover plus extra triggers for Seris. So every round, if you have these guys coming back, you get 2 free ticks on Seris's timer, meaning it is that much easier to pull her out of the graveyard every single round. So you're getting, if you discard both of these in round 1, you're getting 5 free ticks on Seris, because Olgierd will not be coming back in the first round, but he will be coming back the second and the third round, and Morkvarg will be coming back all 3 rounds for 5 resurrects right there. So they're very good synergy with this deck, and they're also cards you are completely okay with discarding in almost any situation. And then we'll go to Donar. Donar is one of those cards that a lot of people hate. The reason is because he has a bit of RNG to him in that you play him, he's a lock card, and he discards a random bronze card from your opponent's deck. Now, what this means is you get a free discard at no cost to yourself, buffing all of your captains. It also means if you hit a bronze unit, you might A, hit something very valuable to your opponent, and B, you might get value out of your ships. So that discarding of their Reaver Hunter now cripples their deck and does 2 damage to them. That's pretty good. He's a very good resurrect target for Sigdrifa. Probably the best resurrect target for Sigdrifa in this deck, simply because of his discard synergy. You can even play him without lock targets on the field. You play him first card of the game, for example, he will still pull a card from your opponent's deck, even though he cannot lock anything on the battlefield. Very good card in this deck, especially. So then we have Grimaced. Grimaced, as I mentioned before, can be used as a good tech against, say, cow carcasses and traps. He's also good for a last second weather clear if you're against a Dagon, for example, and you have the last say in round 3. It might be worth it to save him as a weather clear depending on how your opponent is playing. A lot of the times though, it might be better to clear early and save that damage you're taking, but odds are they'll have another fog waiting for you, so if you're going to clear weather, you do it really late. Most of the time though, you're going to be using him for his blood curdling roar to get an 11-point card on the field, which makes him a 13-point play because he's a 3-point body. You'll be eating a Freya, putting an 11-point card. So 11 plus 3 minus 1 is 13. Very good power play in round 3 because you usually will have a Freya out there as well. And then you have Sigdrifa. Sigdrifa is a very obvious card in this deck because you want Resurrects and because your silvers are not bad Resurrect targets. She can also be used to resurrect any of your bronzes, and she's still fine to do that. It's not a huge waste. These are good Resurrect silvers, but they're not crucial. They're not like Champion of Champions Reliant deck type silvers. These are just kind of extras not extras, but they're not as singular. They're not as focused. Deck isn't focused on the silver cards as much for its power. So that kind of finishes up the silver cards. So we'll get to the bronzes. The first ones we'll start with is the ships. So the ships here are 6 points that do 2 damage every time a unit is discarded on your side into your graveyard. These, like Mangonels and Commando Neophytes, are not used that often, but in this deck they work rather well. Simply because you can get by with even only having one of them, and because you have so much discard going on in this deck that getting them in rounds 2 or 3 is not the worst thing. Getting, Commando Neophyte or Mangonel, that might not be nearly as good. They're definitely better to get early. And if you can manage to get 3 of these out in round 1 without getting them killed or locked, you're pretty much going to win that round, unless you have some big mistakes going on, or you're playing against dwarfs and you don't have coral and they can just outpower you through sheer will. Other than that, these are very self-explanatory cards because of the amount of discard going on in the deck. They're used to force round 1, very powerful, adds even more tempo to your high tempo plays with Bran, and they make your pirates even better because now your pirates are no longer just thinning, they're also damage. So that brings us to the pirates. Pirates, you play one, you discard the others from deck. Very obvious in this deck. Discard for free, getting rid of 2 cards for no cost, and then you get 2 shots per ship. Very good cards here. They're also not bad resurrect targets because in round 3 they are 8 points because they have the veteran tag. So they're usually what you end up resurrecting, strangely enough, even though they are just a 8-point bronze body. Still not a bad play though. Play a res for 8 plus 1 is 9, maybe pulling Ceres out for 7, 16-point play. That's pretty good, even though it's only an 8-point bronze. And then we have our raiders. Raiders, I've already mentioned some of their synergies. Anytime they can get discarded, they come back, so they're very good cards in this deck. They are resurrects and discards. They are like the embodiment of this deck, because this deck is centered around discard and resurrect. So, I already mentioned their synergy with Lugos and Ermion and Bran, so I don't think there's much more to talk about there. Then we have the captains. The captains also, they just work so well with the synergy of this deck because they're discard-based buffs. They also have the veteran tag, which means they are a 7 strength-based body in round 3, plus all of the buffs from discards. So you discard, say, 10 times, these are 17 strength. That's really damn powerful. So you can use these to try to force a round in 1 or 2. You don't have to save all of these for round 3. You can, say, play 2 of these in round 1 to ensure that you win in certain matchups that you really want to force a round 1. In round 1, you should still have enough discards to make them worth playing later in round 1. Very good cards here. Very powerful. These are one of these plus Ceres plus a res into an 8 in Ceres pulled plus your carryover is a very good finisher. You could have, say, 17 plus 1 plus 8 for what was that, 9, 26 plus Saris at 7 for 33 points in 2 plays. That's pretty crazy right there. You're not even using something like QueensGuard to do it. And then we have our priestesses. And a lot of people ask, why do you run 3 priestesses when you only have pirates to res? And the answer is simple. You don't only have pirates to res, you can also res your ships, for example. Not a terrible res. In round 3, if you can get 1 discard off, the ships are worth the same as a pirate. Even then, they're not great res targets on first glance, but then you remember they are great synergy with Saris. They're also not bad discard targets themselves, because even though they're doomed, discarding a card does not banish it. Discarding a priestess, it sits in your graveyard, and you can play a priestess, res the priestess, and get 2 resurrects off, putting 2 ticks on Saris. So if you're in a bad situation, you have to discard one of these in order to keep a silver or a gold, it's probably fine to do so, because you could resurrect it later, still getting ticks on Saris out of her, which is one of the main reasons they're in the deck in the first place. So that pretty much covers all of the cards in the deck. And you can kind of see how much synergy is going on in this deck. They're like, all of the cards are working together. You have Resurrect and Discard working very well together here, in so many different ways, which is why the deck works very well. It has a lot of plays that once they're played, they're not going to be able to be stopped. As in, they're play it and its value's there. Bran into Saris, Morkvarg, and Raider. For the most part, the only thing that your opponent can stop is Morkvarg, and almost no one is going to waste locks on Morkvarg anymore, because they know you'll have Donar coming in, well, potentially have Donar coming in, and your ships are a more valuable lock target than Morkvarg, because Morkvarg is just not very powerful. He's a tick on Saris, but they're going to try to force your reses out in other ways, most likely, in order to force your Saris out in round 2, maybe, and then leave you with not enough reses to pull her in round 3, instead of stopping your Morkvarg res. Because they know stopping the Morkvarg res may just make it easier for you to not res Saris in round 2, and leave her with, say, 1 tick in round 3. Whereas if Morkvarg was still there, that 1 tick would have happened, and she would have been pulled, and you wouldn't have enough reses. It's a very weird scenario, and locking Morkvarg and Olgierd just almost never happens. The only time you see it happen is if you only get 1 ship, and you're facing Radovid or Nilfgaard. Now, that almost never happens anymore, so it's not as big of a concern, because they may lock your 1 ship and they may lock your Morkvarg, but that ship has already gotten a lot of its value. You've already played Bran at that point, so you've gotten a lot of value out of the ship. It's already been a 12-point card, and you might even be able to get another ship in another way, place it on the board. They don't have any more locks. You might even be able to just, unlock the ship with Donar instead, stealing an opponent's unit and unlocking it firing as well. So there's just not a whole lot that can be just straight up locked. Morkvarg at that point would be a little less useful to you, but not the end of the world. It also just has a lot of power. Ships are very good power round 1. Captains are very good power in all 3 rounds. Saris is very good power in all 3 rounds. Coral is very, very high power in whatever round you play her in. Lugos, the same thing, very high power. You either are going to snipe off something very valuable, or play him as a very high value play in round 3, for example. Ermion, very good tech, or I guess pull card, is allowing you to get through your deck. Also doing discards, buffing your deck. So just a lot of synergies here, and a lot of plays that once they happen, they're done. Their value is had, and your opponent's not going to be able to do that much to it. They can scorch your captains at the end, but a lot of times if they're playing a deck that is going to rely on Scorch, they're not going to be able to deal with the rest of your power, i.e. Lugos plus Saris plus whatever you're hitting on your opponent's side of the battlefield. Lots of gold power there, lots of damage to your opponent. Bad situation for them. You may lose a captain. You might be able to stagger one of your captains so it doesn't die to Scorch. They play a second Scorch. They might damage you. If they're doing that though, they might just not have enough power on their side of the board at that point. Depends on what they're doing. But in general, this is a very powerful deck, and I highly recommend playing it. Got to, I believe, top 500 when I was first playing it, and then, got sidetracked. But it's a very, very fun deck, very powerful deck. So that should cover it. And I will leave a link to the original Gwent DB that I found by MDDZZZ, who I believe was the original maker of this deck. He had a slight change to it, and we made a tweak in the Gwendolyn's Invitational tournament. So this is the version that we used for that tournament instead of his version on GwentDB, but he has a guide there as well. I'm also going to link to my Twitch channel as well, so if you want to check that out, go for it. But that's about it for today, so thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Adios.